"You'll give me 12 sons," the Navajo warrior said to the bride he bought at auction. His voice was low, steady as thunder rolling over desert stone. The crowd laughed, but he didn't flinch. He placed 4 silver coins in the dust, lifted her with one arm, and walked into the sun. She was barely 18, sold like cattle. She'd never known kindness, never known a man who didn't speak in fists or numbers. But this man, scarred and silent, didn't take her to a brothel or a ranch. He took her to a mountain and waited and watched. Why would a warrior pay for a girl he didn't touch? Why did he build a cradle before a bed? In a land ruled by cruelty, where was the line between ownership and protection? The townsfolk whispered. The girl watched the seasons change, and the warrior waited for the wind to speak. When a warrior makes a vow and the desert holds its breath, one question remains. Was it fate that brought them together, or something deeper, something older than the dust itself? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories like this one travel farther than any writer ever could. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still matter where you live, then you belong here too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. The sun hung low over the border town of Gila Crossing, casting long amber shadows across cracked clay and crooked porches. Dust rose from every step like ghosts of something buried too long. The townsfolk gathered like crows, hungry for spectacle, crowding the square where makeshift wooden planks had been hammered into a platform. An auction block not for cattle, but for people. And today it was Clara's turn. She wore a thin muslin dress, the color of faded snow, stained at the hem with old mud and dried blood. Her eyes, wide and sunburnt, scanned the crowd. She could not look at the man behind her, her stepfather, Jasper Blyde, a crooked-toothed drunk who spat tobacco between threats and called it parenting. He held her wrist like she was a rope-worn mare, not yet broken, but close. She was 18 barely, though her silence made her seem older. Jasper had placed a sign beside her, virginal, breeder stock, healthy hips. The crowd laughed. Coins clinked. One man called out $2. Another said he'd trade 3 bottles of whiskey and a mule. Another offered his rifle and a knight's favor. Clara stared at the ground, her bare feet aching against the rough planks. She had no tears left. They had been spent in secret behind barns, behind closed doors, behind hands that should never have touched her. She knew what was coming. She knew that once the bidding stopped, her life would no longer be hers. It hadn't been for a long time. Then came the silence. Boot steps, slow and certain, crossed the square. The crowd parted without being asked. A tall man stood at the edge of the platform, wrapped in a blanket the color of storm clouds lined with red stitching that caught the dying sunlight. His long black hair was braided with care, beads woven into the strands like whispers of memory. His face was unreadable, stone carved by fire. He said nothing at first, just looked at Clara. Then without ceremony, he placed 4 silver coins in the dust. 4, not 1, not 2, 4. Gasps, laughter. Even Jasper blinked. "That's the highest bid I've ever seen for a scrap like her," he chuckled nervously. But the man did not look at him. He looked at Clara. "You'll give me 12 sons," he said, his voice deep as canyon echo. The crowd erupted in guffaws, howls. One man slapped his knee. 12? Hope you brought a strong bed and a doctor." But the man did not flinch. He reached out one hand. Clara hesitated. She expected cruelty, expected to be yanked down and thrown across a saddle. But his hand was steady, palm open, and something in his eyes, dark, searching, but not cold, made her step forward. Jasper grabbed the coins greedily. "Take her. She's yours." The man, still silent, wrapped a blanket around Clara's shoulders. It smelled of cedar and ash. Without a word, he lifted her, gently, and carried her away from the laughter, away from the platform, away from everything she had ever known. They passed the saloon, the butcher's shop, the church with the boarded windows. No one followed. No one dared. Clara said nothing as they reached the edge of town. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped rabbit. Her body braced for pain, but he didn't touch her again. He placed her on his horse, an old strong mare, and walked beside it, leading her toward the mountains in the distance. The sun sank behind them, staining the sky with fire. She turned once to look back. No one watched. No one waved. No one missed her. As the town vanished behind hills of scrub and rock, Clara pulled the blanket tighter. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he meant by 12 sons. She didn't even know where they were going. But for the first time in years, no one shouted at her. No one grabbed her. No one called her worthless. The man said nothing as they climbed into the wild, and she began to wonder, not what he would do to her, but why he had chosen her at all. The trail wound upward through the forest, growing thinner with each step until it vanished beneath tall pines and soft moss. The horse breathed heavily, hooves pressing into dirt damp with morning mist. Clara held tight to the saddle horn, her fingers stiff with fear. The man, Tazhi, though she still didn't know his name, walked ahead in silence, guiding the mare by the reins. He hadn't spoken since they left Gila Crossing. Not a word, no commands, no threats, just the steady rhythm of boots in soil and a quiet that felt heavier than chains. They crested a ridge just as dusk fell. Below, in a clearing framed by towering evergreens, stood a small log cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney. Not wild or frantic, but steady, orderly. The cabin looked sturdy, almost proud, its roof blanketed with bark and lichen, its windows covered with oiled paper instead of glass. It was nothing like the falling down sheds she'd known. This place had been made by hands that cared. Tazhi led the horse to a post and tied it. Then he turned and helped her down. He didn't yank her. He didn't touch her longer than he had to. He simply steadied her feet. Clara stepped onto the ground, still wrapped in the thick wool blanket he'd given her. Her legs trembled. She wasn't sure if it was from cold or the unspoken question rattling inside her. Why bring me here? What are you waiting for? Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, smoked meat, and something floral, maybe sage or lavender. There was a hearth, already warm with coals. A pot simmered over the fire, filling the space with the scent of stew. A single bed stood against the wall, covered in hand-woven blankets. A wooden table sat beneath a small window, with 2 chairs beside it. A shelf of jars lined one wall. Honey, dried roots, something yellow and crumbling like cornmeal. And in the far corner, half hidden in shadow, stood a cradle, small, carved, empty. Tazhi motioned to the chair. Clara sat. He ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before her, along with a wooden spoon. He poured water into a tin cup and set it beside the bowl. Then he stepped back, still silent. She ate. Her stomach trembled with every bite, unsure whether to trust the warmth. She'd been fed before fists, before nights she tried to forget. But this stew tasted like real food, like home. As she finished, Tazhi walked to a small chest and pulled out a folded dress, plain, but clean, and placed it beside her. Then he left. She heard the door shut, and then nothing. Curious, she peeked through the door cracks. He was rolling out a bedroll beneath the stars, placing it near the stacked woodpile. He laid down with his arms crossed over his chest and eyes toward the sky, as if sleep was a prayer he hoped the moon might answer. She stayed awake for hours, waiting for the trick, waiting for the mask to fall. But morning came, and he hadn't touched the door. Not once. The next day passed like the one before. He brought in more water, chopped wood without comment, stirred the stew without glancing at her. When she tried to speak, he only nodded. When she watched him from the window, he didn't flinch or hide. He was a shadow in motion, always moving, always silent. On the third day, she finally walked to the cradle. The wood was dark, sanded smooth, its corners worn by time and fingers. Inside lay a single quilt, stitched with faded suns and stars. It was too perfect, too clean. No child had ever used it, or one had once and never again. She ran her fingers along the edge and felt a strange chill. Not fear, not sadness, something else. That night she didn't bolt the door. She just lay beneath the quilted blanket and listened to the fire crackle. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old voice humming. She didn't know who this man was or why he'd built a home with no one in it, but she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't waiting to take something from her. Maybe he was waiting to give something back. The days had begun to stretch longer, and the cold breath of early spring carried warmth in its edges. Clara found herself rising before the fire had fully faded, not because she was ordered to, but because the quiet outside the cabin seemed to call her name. Birds sang from high branches with no audience, but the sky and the forest floor, padded in old needles and damp leaves, welcomed her steps without protest. The woods beyond the cabin were not wild in the way the world had been, dangerous and mean, but wild in a way that felt eternal, watched over, alive. She began walking a little farther each day, never too far from the clearing, but enough to taste something like freedom. The trees whispered above her, old pines and cottonwoods bending as if to listen. There was no path, only impressions of one, animal trails, flattened grass, grooves where wagon wheels had never turned. She followed the sound of water once and found a stream, shallow and laughing over flat stones. There, half buried beneath a bed of moss, she noticed something odd. A bundle of sage, tightly bound and tied with red string, tucked beneath a smooth white rock. Beside it, a feather, hawk or eagle she couldn't tell. It was not litter. It was placed, deliberate, sacred. The next day she found another offering near the base of a hollowed tree. 3 river stones arranged in a triangle, each etched with charcoal marks she couldn't read. She didn't touch them. Somehow she knew she shouldn't. They weren't for her. Or maybe they were, but not yet. Sometimes when she turned back toward the cabin, she'd catch sight of him, Tazhi, standing between trees, unmoving as a stone statue, watching, not with menace, not even curiosity, but like a guardian ensuring she wouldn't lose herself in the woods. He never approached, never called out. He simply stood there, tall and silent, letting her wander as she pleased. On the 7th evening, when the sun cast its last gold over the treetops and the wind turned colder, she saw him kneeling in the woods. She hadn't meant to spy, but the sight stopped her breath. Tazhi knelt before a circle of stones not far from the stream, his head bowed, lips moving in rhythm with the wind. His voice was low, not chanting, but speaking, like a man telling a story to someone unseen. His hands were open, palms up, and beside him was a small woven pouch that glinted in the fading light. She heard only fragments, names, pleas, words too soft to hold meaning, yet heavy with feeling. She didn't move. She barely breathed. This was not madness. It was mourning. That night, Clara didn't eat. She sat on the edge of the bed with her arms around her knees, thinking of the way his shoulders had trembled as he spoke to no one. When sleep finally took her, it came in shadows and echoes. She dreamt of a woman screaming in a language she didn't understand, her voice full of pain. A cradle rocked in an empty room. The wind howled like it had lost something it would never find again. She woke with her heart racing and her hands clenched. The fire had gone cold. Clara rose and walked to the cradle. She touched the edge gently and whispered, "Who were you?" She didn't know if she meant the man or the child, but the question lingered, unanswered, in the silence of the mountain home. The morning was cold enough for Clara's breath to drift like pale smoke as she moved about the cabin. She had begun tidying the small space as a way to calm herself, to order her thoughts, to remind herself she still existed. In the corner, beneath a stack of folded blankets and an old saddlebag, she noticed a wooden trunk. It was heavier than it looked, made from dark pine with iron hinges worn by years of use. She hesitated before touching it. Something about it felt private, sealed like a wound. But curiosity had been gnawing at her ever since she saw the offerings in the woods and heard Tazhi speaking to the wind. This man was no simple recluse. He was bound to something unseen. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a neat stack of letters, each folded carefully, tied with thin strips of rawhide. The top one was open, its edges soft from being handled. In the pale morning light, she saw two languages interlaced on the page, English and Navajo, side by side like two hands clasped. The handwriting was strong and steady, but carried an ache she could feel even before she read the words. Each letter began with a name, Allah. They spoke of the cabin, of the trees, of a child's laughter remembered like an echo. They ended the same way, each one. When you return, I'll be ready. Her fingers trembled. She felt like an intruder standing in the center of someone's broken prayer. She folded the letter back into place and shut the trunk gently. It was not hers to read, but the weight of those unsent words clung to her. Someone had been lost. Someone still waited for. She wondered what kind of love could stretch across years of silence, and what kind of grief could keep a man kneeling in the woods. That night, after Tazhi retreated outside to his bedroll, Clara sat at the table with a stub of pencil she found in the cupboard. She took a scrap of paper from the bottom of the trunk, a blank sheet he'd kept there, and began to write. Not to him, not to anyone near. She wrote to her sister Lottie, the one she hadn't seen in 5 years since their mother died and the world turned cruel. She wrote about the man who had bought her but had not touched her. She wrote about the silence of the pines, about the carved cradle, about how her fear was still there, but changing shape, softening around the edges. She wrote until her hand cramped. She didn't sign it. She didn't fold it. She didn't know if she would ever send it. But when she laid the pencil down, she felt a small shift inside herself, like a door opening a crack. Each night afterward, she wrote another, telling Lottie things she had never told anyone. With each word, she felt less like a shadow and more like a person reclaiming her name. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet guess, was that after she fell asleep, Tazhi would slip inside the cabin. He would stand by the table in the glow of the dying fire and read her words without touching the page, his eyes moving slowly, as though memorizing each line. He would fold the paper carefully and set it back, his face unreadable, his heart shifting in quiet ways he couldn't yet name. And when dawn came, he would still rise before her and chop wood without a sound, as if nothing had changed at all. The wind came down from the high cliffs in sharp, restless gusts that day, stirring the pine needles and setting the smoke from the chimney in wild spirals. Clara was inside folding blankets when she heard it, the unmistakable clop of hooves crunching across the frost-hardened dirt. She stepped to the window and peered out, her hands pausing mid-fold. A mule, dark and shaggy, ambled into the clearing, its sides heavy with bundles tied in faded cloth. Beside it walked a woman, her hair gray and plaited tight, her shawl woven with threadbare colors. Her steps were slow but sure, like someone who'd walked farther than most men had ridden. Tazhi stepped out of the woods then, as if summoned. He had a bundle of firewood in his arms, but when he saw the woman, he dropped it without a word. She didn't speak either, only walked up to him and pulled him into an embrace that looked like it belonged to another lifetime. Clara watched from the window, her heart prickling with something like jealousy or fear or both. It wasn't the closeness that startled her. It was the way Tazhi allowed it. Like she was one of the few souls allowed past whatever wall he lived behind. When the woman finally turned toward the cabin, her eyes met Clara's through the glass. Not judgmental, not prying, just knowing. They all sat together that evening. Tazhi cooked as he always did, but this time he made more than usual. Venison stew with wild potatoes and roasted corn mash, served hot and fragrant. The woman, Maureen, warmed her hands by the fire and spoke to Clara like they'd already met, her voice low and steady, like water moving over stone. "I remember when this cabin was being built," she said, sipping slowly. "He carved every beam himself, laid stone while his hands were still shaking. It wasn't for him, you know. It was for the ones he lost." Clara said nothing at first, only watched the fire twist and rise in the hearth. His wife's name was Allah, and the boys, they were barely walking. Twins, big eyes like their mama. The soldiers came early, claiming land that was never theirs. Burned everything, took what they wanted, left no bodies, just ash, and a silence that's been living with him ever since. Maureen stirred the stew again, her eyes fixed on the flames. He never buried them. Can't grieve something that isn't truly gone. So he waits and builds. And cooks for ghosts. Clara felt the weight of those words settle deep into her bones. She glanced at Tazhi. He was quiet, focused on drying the dishes with a worn cloth. His expression gave nothing away, but his shoulders were tight, like someone bracing for an avalanche that never stopped falling. "He doesn't need a bride," Maureen continued, softer now. "He needs a reason, to stay, to plant, to speak." Clara's spoon hovered above her bowl. The words stirred something sharp in her. Was she that reason, or just a name he was trying to replace? A shadow to stuff inside an old shape left behind by love? She couldn't tell. And worse, she didn't know which answer she feared more. That night, after Maureen had gone to sleep in the spare corner of the cabin and Tazhi had slipped outside to his bedroll beneath the stars, Clara sat at the table with her pencil and paper. She wrote, "He built a home for people he still believes might come back. And now I'm here, living in their place. What does that make me, Lottie? Not his. Not yet. Maybe never. But he hasn't touched me, and somehow that breaks my heart more than if he had." She folded the page and set it with the others. Then she walked to the cradle and ran her fingers along its smooth edges. The quilt inside remained untouched. But tonight, it didn't feel quite so cold. The scream came just after sunrise, high and desperate, a sound not made by man, but by something large and wounded. Clara froze where she stood near the cabin's doorway, her hands full of kindling. The horses had been restless all night, their snorts rising sharp in the dark, and now came the proof that something had been stalking them. She dropped the wood and ran toward the corral. Maureen was already there, barefoot in the dirt, her shawl thrown over her shoulders. A blur of motion streaked across the yard, golden fur low to the ground, teeth flashing. The cougar had latched onto the flank of the younger mare, dragging her sideways. Then, with a sound like stone breaking, Tazhi charged into view. He didn't carry a rifle, only a hunting knife and his own weight. He tackled the animal from the side, slamming it into the dirt with a thud that echoed through the trees. They rolled, man and beast, in a fury of blood and muscle. Clara screamed, but no one heard her. Maureen stood still as stone. The cougar snarled and slashed, and Tazhi's knife struck over and over. Then silence. The animal lay still. Blood seeped into the earth. The mare kicked once, then stilled, her wound deep but not fatal. Tazhi staggered back, hand pressed to his side. It was only when he collapsed that Clara moved. Inside the cabin, they laid him on the floor near the fire. His shirt was already soaked through, crimson blooming fast. Maureen worked quickly, mixing herbs with hot water, tearing strips of linen. Clara knelt beside her, holding the bowl, her hands shaking too badly to be useful. "Breathe, girl," Maureen whispered. "He's not gone yet." When they peeled back his shirt, Clara gasped. The cut was deep, running from his ribs to his hip like the cougar had tried to open him in half. But beneath that wound were others, old ones, scars etched into his skin in clean, deliberate lines. Circles, hash marks, what looked like flames, not from battles but from ceremony. "What? What are those?" she asked, unable to look away. Maureen didn't answer, but Tazhi, barely conscious, opened his eyes. "Marks for mourning," he whispered, each line a name, each cut a promise. Clara swallowed hard. "My wife," he continued, "my sons. I marked them into my skin so the wind wouldn't forget." Clara leaned closer, brushing his hair back. His face was pale, drawn tight with pain, but his voice stayed steady. "They died crying my name. I heard them, but I couldn't reach them in time." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. The firelight flickered across his chest, dancing along the broken map of his grief. That night Clara didn't write. She lay awake, listening to Tazhi breathe. Her dreams came hot and cruel, flames licking up the side of a cradle, screams swallowed by smoke, a tiny hand reaching for hers just before the earth opened up and took it. She woke covered in sweat, heart pounding like a drumbeat of guilt. Sitting by the hearth, she realized something sharp and inescapable. She knew that feeling, the helplessness, the scream trapped inside. She had been the child reaching out, and the woman no one came back for. They were both survivors bound not by love or law, but by wounds that refused to close. She didn't know what came next, but in the silence between breaths, she no longer felt like a stranger in his home. She felt like a witness, and maybe, just maybe, something more. The first snowfall came early that year, unannounced and bitter. It painted the forest white in silence, dusting the pine branches and covering the garden beds Clara had just cleared. The cabin, tucked into the edge of the mountain, became a single glowing point in a sea of cold and quiet. Smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, the fire cracked steadily, the stew simmered, and Clara stitched a patch onto the elbow of Tazhi's shirt while he sharpened a blade by the doorway. It felt like a picture drawn by someone who believed in peace. But peace, Clara had learned, was not something the world gave freely. It was something you had to guard, even when it seemed harmless. That night, the wind howled low through the trees, dragging long shadows across the snow. Clara stirred in her sleep, sensing something. Not a sound exactly, but a shift, a weight in the air. She rose, pulled the blanket tighter around her, and stepped toward the door. Through the frost-glazed window, she saw movement, a blur, small and fast, darting near the porch. She opened the door softly, her breath catching as the cold slapped her skin. In the pale moonlight, a boy knelt beside the firewood stack, thin arms wrapped around a sack of potatoes. His clothes were threadbare, his hands purple with cold. He didn't see her at first. When he did, he dropped the sack and turned to flee, but Tazhi was already there, moving like part of the wind. He didn't yell. He didn't draw his knife. He simply stepped in front of the boy and knelt down. "You hungry?" he asked. The boy blinked, startled. He hesitated, then nodded once. Clara came to the porch, her heart tugging at the sight of him, small, trembling, no older than 12, with eyes too hard for someone so young. Tazhi opened the door and motioned him inside. The boy entered slowly, ready to bolt. He stayed near the wall until the smell of stew pulled him forward. Clara set a bowl in front of him. He didn't thank her, but his hands shook as he gripped the spoon. He ate fast, as if someone might take it away. When he finished, Tazhi gave him a blanket and laid it beside the hearth. No questions, no scolding. Later on, as the fire dimmed and the boy finally let his eyes close, Clara asked his name. "Eli," he whispered. "I ran. From the man with the cart. He hit me when I dropped coins, said I was stupid, said I was his to sell. Clara's chest tightened. She knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. "You're not his," she said. "Not anymore." Eli fell asleep there, curled into the warmth like a stray animal finally let inside. His breathing slowed. The cabin for the first time felt alive, not haunted but hopeful. Tazhi didn't speak that night. He simply watched the boy sleep, his expression unreadable. But when Clara looked again at the cradle in the corner, she noticed something new. The blanket inside had been freshly folded, as if someone expected it might be used soon. Outside, the snow thickened. The forest fell deeper into winter, and Clara, resting near the fire, knew that this sweetness, this warmth of found things, couldn't last forever. But for now it was enough. The snow had begun to thaw, pulling back in patches across the land like a heavy curtain lifting from the stage. Beneath it, the earth showed signs of life, muddy and cold but breathing again. Birds returned, cautious but curious. Sap ran in the trees, and Clara, who now rose each day to tend to the animals with Eli at her side, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that could last. But peace never came without a knock. It arrived in the form of a wagon, black, boxy, and out of place against the pale woods. Clara saw it first, riding up the old ridge trail, two men perched atop it. One was her stepfather, Jasper Blyde, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. The other man wore a fine coat and a bowler hat, too clean for travel, too polished for these mountains. The horses beneath them kicked up mud as they approached, heads tossing like they sensed what their riders carried. Clara's hands trembled, but she didn't run. Not this time. She stepped onto the porch, Eli behind her, clutching her apron. Tazhi stood near the fence, his axe still in hand, blade glinting from morning sun. "Well, well," Jasper called out, swinging off the wagon. "Ain't this a cozy little hideout?" The other man didn't dismount. He removed his gloves one finger at a time, then looked directly at Tazhi. "Name's Rudd Harlan," he said. "I work with the Western Rail Expansion Company. We've got plans for a line running through this territory. Prime land. Yours as it happens." Tazhi didn't move. He didn't speak. Jasper chuckled. "We came for the girl, too. She's blood. Can't just let her vanish into the woods with, well," he gestured vaguely toward Tazhi, sneering. "You understand." Clara stepped forward then, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I'm not your anything," she said. "You're still listed under my name," Jasper snapped. "Ain't no court overturned that. You were sold illegal. I'm just here to set things right." Rudd cleared his throat. "Let's not get tangled in family squabbles. We're prepared to pay handsomely for the land. You can take the money, walk away, or not. But the tracks are coming, one way or another." Tazhi finally spoke. "Leave." Rudd raised an eyebrow. "That a threat?" "No, that's mercy." Jasper barked a laugh. "He thinks this is still the old days. Law's down the mountain now. Real law. White law." Clara stepped down from the porch and stood beside Tazhi. "You're not taking me back," she said. "Not alive." Eli crept to her side, gripping a stick like it was a sword. His eyes were wild with fear, but he didn't back down. Rudd clicked his tongue, unimpressed. "You've got 40 acres and no deed the railroad recognizes. That makes you squatters, and squatters don't get trials. They get cleared." Tazhi took one slow step forward, still holding the axe. Rudd raised his hands, signaling retreat. "No need to escalate. We'll come back with the proper papers." Jasper spat on the ground and followed him back to the wagon. As they rode off, Rudd called over his shoulder, "Enjoy your time in the hills, it's running out." Clara didn't speak for a long time after they disappeared down the trail. She only stared into the trees, where winter still clung in patches of white. The quiet returned, but it was different now. Fragile. She knew the law would not protect her. The world would not bend because she asked it to. But her legs no longer shook. She would not be taken again, not without a fight. The sun crept slowly over the mountain ridge, warming the mist in the trees and brushing gold across the cabin roof. Clara stood at the threshold, her coat wrapped tight and her breath visible in the morning air. Tazhi stood beside her, saddling the mule with quiet purpose. Neither of them spoke much that morning. They didn't need to. A decision had been made. The night after Rudd's visit had passed in uneasy silence. Tazhi hadn't slept. Clara knew because she hadn't either. She'd heard him moving through the night, rechecking locks, stacking more firewood, standing long hours outside beneath the stars, eyes scanning the trees. Now they rode eastward through the forest, past the stream where Clara had once found bundles of sage, and down an old path beaten into the earth by generations who had walked it long before any town had risen below. Tazhi didn't take her to a church or a courthouse. He took her to a high open ridge where the land unfolded in all directions, and the sky touched the earth with reverence. The elder was waiting there, his face weathered like the cliffs, his eyes deep as water beneath stone. His name was Yiska, and he said little when they arrived. But when he looked at Clara, he nodded, as if seeing something not yet spoken. Tazhi stood to the side while Clara knelt beside the fire they built together. The elder spoke in Navajo, voice calm and low, the syllables rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. He placed a strand of red yarn in her palm, tied with feathers and dried cedar, and pressed his hand over hers. "You came through the fire," he said, "but you are not ash. You are the breath after." He called her Ahehi, gratitude, not because she owed anything, but because, as he said, the world had not swallowed her, and because sometimes surviving was a kind of prayer answered. Clara wept, not loudly, not with shame, but with the kind of tears that left the heart clean. But peace didn't follow them back down the mountain. Word travels faster than hoofbeats when fear walks behind it. By the time they returned to the cabin, the town was already stirring. People spoke in hushed tones on porches. A girl once missing now returned with a name no one could pronounce and a story no one wanted to believe. Rudd came back, this time not with words, but with a uniformed man on a brown gelding, a federal marshal named Hawley, flanked by 2 deputies. He carried papers with sharp edges and colder intentions, deeds stamped in ink, guardianship orders signed by a judge 3 towns over. "She's still property of her kin," the marshal declared, unfolding the papers like a weapon, "until a federal court says otherwise." Tazhi said nothing. His stance remained steady. Clara, however, stepped forward. "I'm not property," she said, her voice rising clear and firm. "Not of him, not of anyone." The marshal raised a brow. "These papers say otherwise, ma'am." "He didn't take me," she continued, looking not at them, but at the watching townsfolk gathering near the road. "He saved me. The man who calls himself my family sold me like a mule. The man you call criminal gave me shelter, food, a name." There was murmuring in the crowd, doubt, disbelief. Some whispered of witchcraft, of manipulation, that she'd been enchanted or deceived. "She's bewitched," someone muttered. "Girls don't choose savages." But others looked on with something else in their eyes. Not trust yet, but questions. The marshal sighed and folded the papers. "We'll return," he said, "with the proper writs." They rode off without taking her, but not because they changed their minds, because they were setting the table for something bigger. That night, Clara sat at the table and wrote to Lottie again. "They want to own me on paper, but they don't know I've already been named." She signed it, not as Clara, but as Ahehi, and for the first time she meant it. The church stood at the center of town, squat and plain, with its whitewashed boards peeling in the sun. It had once been a place of prayer, then a schoolhouse, now a meeting hall when trouble stirred too loud to ignore. That day, every pew was filled, and the walls breathed with murmurs. Some folks stood along the sides, arms crossed, lips tight, eyes flicking toward the front where Sheriff Talmadge sat stiffly beside the mayor. Between them stood Rudd Harlan in a tailored coat, clean boots tapping against the floorboards like the man already owned the place. The buzz quieted when the doors creaked open and Maureen entered. She walked with the slow dignity of someone who had survived too much to be rushed. Her gray braid was coiled tight, her shawl fastened with a silver pin that had belonged to her mother. Behind her came Clara, her shoulders squared, and Eli gripping her hand like it was the last true thing in the world. Tazhi did not enter with them. He remained outside, knowing his presence in that room might bring more heat than light. Maureen didn't wait for permission. She stepped forward, unrolling a leather satchel and laying its contents on the table in front of the sheriff. "These," she said, her voice steady and loud enough to carry, "are land grants issued before the war. This one's in the name of Tazhi's grandfather, recognized by the territory, stamped by the Bureau. You'll see the boundaries match the property Rudd Harlan's been sniffing after." She paused, letting that sink in. Rudd shifted in his chair but said nothing. "These letters," Maureen continued, holding up a small stack of yellowed pages, "were written by Alanez, Tazhi's wife. They detail the seizure of their first homestead by cavalry. Names, dates, witnesses." A hush fell over the room. Papers like those didn't just appear. They meant something. "And this," she said, lifting a final item, a small bound book with frayed edges, "is a journal, not Tazhi's. It belonged to a foreman for the railroad, found near the old survey camp. Inside, he outlines plans to forge ownership claims, displace tribal families, and clean the ridgeline before laying track. His words, not mine." Gasps rose from the crowd. The mayor looked at the sheriff. The sheriff scratched his beard, uneasy. Maureen turned then, looking not at the men in charge, but at the people, the storekeepers, the widows, the miners and wives clutching children on their laps. "I've delivered babies in this town for 20 years, she said. "I've buried your dead, stitched your wounds, stood by your sick beds, so I'll speak plainly. That girl," she pointed to Clara, "was sold like cattle. That boy," she placed her hand on Eli's head, "was beaten and used like a tool. And the man you call savage, he gave them a home, asked for nothing, took nothing." A few townsfolk nodded. A woman in the back whispered, "I seen her with the boy. They smile now. That ain't fear." Maureen continued, "You want to know what kind of town you live in? Look around, because today you decide. You uphold the word of a drunk who beat his stepdaughter and a company that lies for land. Or you protect those who did what none of us had the courage to do, shelter the broken." The silence afterward was different, heavy, not with judgment, but with reckoning. Some looked away, ashamed. Others sat taller. A farmer near the front removed his hat, holding it against his chest. No vote was taken, no ruling made, but the room had shifted. Outside, as the doors opened and people spilled into the sun, Clara felt the air move in her favor for the first time in her life, not because the law had changed, but because someone had finally spoken the truth loud enough that others couldn't pretend not to hear it. The barn burned in the middle of the night. No warning, no sound until the flames had already swallowed half the roof. Clara woke to the crackle, the fierce orange light flickering through the cabin window, like the sun had come too early and too angry. Tazhi was already outside, dousing the fire with buckets drawn from the well, his face hard, movements fast but controlled. Clara and Eli joined him, Maureen trailing behind, her hair loose from sleep. They fought the fire until it died in its own smoke. The barn reduced to black ribs jutting from scorched earth. The chickens were next. 2 days later, Clara found them scattered near the coop, necks twisted, feathers bloodied and scattered like a warning. She dropped to her knees, unable to breathe for a moment. Eli stood behind her, silent, his fists clenched tight. He didn't ask what kind of animal could do this. They both knew it wasn't an animal. Tazhi said nothing, but that night he didn't sleep. He sat outside with his knife unsheathed, sharpening it slowly, his eyes on the woods. When Clara brought him tea, he took it without speaking, but he nodded once, and that small gesture said more than any words. Then Eli vanished. He was gone by morning. Clara searched the woods, calling his name until her voice turned raw. Tazhi rode down to the edge of town and back. Maureen checked the creek beds, the high ridges, even the old bear den. Hours passed, then a day. The air hung thick with dread. He returned near dusk the next evening, walking out of the trees with mud on his face and a limp in his step. He wouldn't say where he'd been, only that two men in black coats had chased him when he went to pick berries near the ridge. One had a scar across his jaw. The other called him boy like it was poison. Clara held him for a long time that night. He shook quietly in her arms, the kind of shaking that doesn't come from cold, but from something deeper, something that tries to make a home inside you. The next day, Maureen rode to town with the preacher. They knocked on every door, collecting signatures on worn parchment, urging neighbors to stand for justice, to send for a territorial judge before the law was buried beneath lies and bullets. Some agreed, some refused. Most hesitated, but a few names became many. Back at the cabin, Tazhi took Clara into the woods and handed her a rifle. "Not for revenge," he said, his voice low. "For the moment you must choose." He showed her how to load it, how to brace her shoulder, how to steady her breath. At first, she flinched with every pull of the trigger. By the fifth shot, her hands were still. By the 10th, her aim was true. Each blast echoed through the trees like a vow. She wasn't learning to hurt. She was learning to stand. The world outside was sharpening its edges, preparing to carve its name into them again. But this time, Clara wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was becoming the kind of woman who could protect what had been given, what had been rebuilt with hands and silence and love. She understood now. Strength wasn't loud. It didn't swagger or scream. It stood still, rifle in hand, and waited for the dark to show itself. The church was colder than usual that morning, the kind of cold that settled into the bones, not because of the weather, but because of what was about to be done inside. The pews were full, lined with townsfolk who wore expressions tight as cinched belts. Curiosity, judgment, fear. They had come to witness what was being called a hearing, though it felt more like a reckoning. At the front stood a temporary bench, set up by the preacher and flanked with oil lamps and paper. Behind it sat Judge Mercer, a man brought from Flagstaff by petition and pressure. He was old, long-faced, and slow-spoken, but known for fairness, or as fair as a man could be in a land where law was still tangled with land and color. Rudd Harlan stood tall, confident in his clean coat and polished boots, a stack of papers spread before him like weapons. Beside him stood Jasper Blyde, Clara's stepfather, sweating beneath his hat, eyes darting toward the door like he was waiting for someone to drag him out. Tazhi sat at the back of the room, silent as always, Maureen beside him. Clara stood near the front, hands folded, her jaw tight. She didn't shake, not anymore. Judge Mercer began with a simple phrase. "We're here to determine what belongs to who and by what right." Rudd was the first to speak. He spoke confidently, smoothly, his words heavy with false concern. He presented forged deeds, fake guardianship papers, affidavits signed by men who'd never stepped foot near the land they claimed to own. He referred to Clara as property of record, called Tazhi a squatter, and painted himself as a man simply following proper channels. When he finished, the room buzzed with whispers. Then Clara stepped forward. She didn't speak right away. She looked at the crowd, at people who had seen her as a girl, a burden, a ghost. She met their eyes one by one. "I was sold," she said finally. "Sold like livestock, by the man who stands here calling himself my kin." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "He beat me. He locked me in sheds. Called me names that made me forget I was human." She held up her sleeve, revealing an old scar along her forearm. "He did this with a broken bottle because I spilled his whiskey. I was 14. She looked at Tazhi. "The man you say took me?" Her voice trembled but did not break. "He never touched me, not once. He waited. He listened. He saw me." A silence fell like snowfall, thick, heavy, undeniable. Then Eli stepped forward, hat clutched in his hands. His voice was small but clear. "I saw the railroad men. They kicked me, called me a thief, said I was less than nothing. Tazhi fed me. Clara gave me a bed." Maureen stood and laid out the journal, the land grants, the letters. She spoke little. She didn't need to. The truth lay in ink and signatures older than any forged claim. Judge Mercer studied everything in silence. Then he looked up at Rudd. "These documents, these so-called deeds, bear names that don't exist, signatures that don't match." Rudd's face flushed. Still, he didn't yield. "The girl's confused, brainwashed. You let this go, you open the floodgates. People like him," he nodded toward Tazhi, "they'll take whatever they want." But the judge held up a hand. "This isn't about what people take. It's about what they've already given, and what was taken from them long before this land was ever surveyed." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Rudd stood stiff, jaw clenched. Jasper turned away, already defeated. But Clara, standing tall in the center of it all, felt something she hadn't in years. Recognition. Not as property, not as a burden, as a person. Seen, heard, free. Dust rose like a curtain drawn by trembling hands, golden and choking in the late afternoon light. The church doors had barely closed behind Judge Mercer when the shouting began. Rudd's voice, sharper now, splintered by rage, cut through the gathering quiet like a whip. "This isn't finished," he bellowed from the steps, his hat crushed in one hand, the other pointing toward the road where his men waited. 6 of them, rough-looking, armed, and hungry for violence. "You think some mountain witch and a pack of half-breeds can outvote the law? That's not justice. That's theater." Clara stood frozen in the doorway, Maureen at her side. The ruling had come like breath after drowning, but Rudd was trying to steal the air again before she could take it in. Tazhi stepped from the shadow of the church with the calm of a man who had walked through fire before and knew it by scent. He was unarmed. His hands were empty, his shirt rolled to the sleeves, dust on his boots. He moved without rush, without fear. "Go home, Rudd," he said quietly. "You lost." "I don't lose," Rudd spat. "Not to ghosts, not to thieves." He grabbed Clara's arm, hard. The church bell never rang, but somehow the town gathered just the same. It started with the blacksmith, who stepped out holding a hammer in one hand and a heavy iron rod in the other. Then the shopkeeper with a long broom handle. Then the preacher, eyes full of quiet fire, carrying nothing but his voice. "No one leaves with her," the preacher said. "Not today, not ever again." Mothers clutched their children. Miners came with rusted pickaxes, teenagers with pitchforks and fence posts. The circle grew wide and thick, and in the center stood Clara, still held by Rudd and Tazhi, unmoving. Rudd's men stepped forward, guns drawn, but they faltered when they saw the crowd. Untrained, yes, but unmoved by fear. A community without uniforms, but full of something older than law. Then from the side came a cry. Eli, barefoot and wild-eyed, darted out of the crowd with a rock in his hand. He moved faster than any man had time to stop. With a furious grunt, he hurled it. The rock struck Rudd square in the jaw. A sickening crack echoed across the square. Rudd fell back, stunned, blood trailing from his mouth. Clara stumbled free, caught by Maureen's outstretched arms. The spell broke. The townspeople surged forward, not with violence but with purpose. One man kicked the rifle from a mercenary's hand. Another wrenched a pistol away. No one was shot. No one died. But in that moment, Rudd's army dissolved like smoke. Tazhi stepped forward and stood over the man who had tried to claim everything with ink and fear. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't speak. He simply looked down and smiled. It was the smallest smile, the kind that barely moved the corners of the mouth but lit the face like dawn over stone. The kind of smile a man wears when he's been proven right without saying a word. Around them, the townspeople stood taller. For the first time, they had chosen not silence, not comfort, but justice. The sound of wagon wheels over packed earth faded into the distance as Rudd Harlan was hauled away in shackles, slumped in defeat. A deputy rode behind the cart, rifle resting across his lap, but there was no fight left in the man they guarded. His jaw was bound in cloth, his eyes swollen, his pride buried somewhere beneath the dust of the road. The townsfolk watched him leave in silence, not with hatred, but with the weary relief of those who have seen a storm pass and are still standing. Clara didn't look back. She stood beside Tazhi and Eli just beyond the church steps, her hands rough from the confrontation, her breath rising in the cool morning air. She didn't need to say anything. The town had spoken, the danger was gone, and something new, something gentle, was beginning to stretch its limbs in the quiet left behind. They returned to the cabin that afternoon, the sun low and golden between the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney before they reached it, and the scent of Maureen's lentil stew clung to the air like a blessing. Inside, the cradle remained in its corner, undisturbed, but the room felt different now, not haunted, not waiting, just still, still and safe. Snow melted slowly in fingers and patches. The edges of the forest darkened with wet soil, and the creek behind the cabin sang louder each day. Tazhi handed Clara a worn pair of gloves and a hand plow with a smooth wooden handle. She turned it in her palms, testing its weight. He led her out to the flat patch of land they'd cleared the previous autumn. The frost had retreated, and the ground, though heavy, gave beneath the blade. He showed her how to cut the furrows, deep and straight, moving with a quiet ease that came from years of repetition. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words stayed rooted. "Land remembers," he said as he moved beside her, guiding her grip. "What we give it, it gives back." She nodded, pressing the blade deeper. When the rows were ready, Clara stepped barefoot into the soil, boots set aside. She knelt, pressing her hands into the earth, feeling its cold breath on her skin. She dropped the first seeds into the furrow, corn, squash, and beans, tucked them into the dirt like wishes. "For spring," she whispered. Tazhi stood beside her, arms folded, the faintest curl in his mouth. Not a smile this time, but something gentler, a quiet approval. Eli, a few feet away, chased a chicken through what remained of the old coop, laughing as he slipped and fell in the mud. His laughter echoed across the clearing, light and free, carrying through the pines. Inside the cabin that evening, Clara lit the fire while Tazhi whittled a new spoon, and Eli read aloud from the old books Maureen had left behind. The rhythm was simple now: meals, laughter, tending to the land, speaking when words mattered. No one asked for more than what was needed. No one took what wasn't offered. In the silence that followed supper, Clara looked out the window and saw the garden bed, dark and furrowed. She touched her belly, not in certainty, but in hope. The world had burned, then frozen, Now it began to bloom. Summer had come softly, with warm winds that rustled through the tall grass and coaxed color from the trees. The garden had taken root well, corn climbing steadily, beans curling around the posts Tazhi had carved, and squash blooming in yellow bursts like little suns on the ground. Clara rose with the light each day, her hands sun-darkened and steady, her laughter coming more freely now, no longer something she guarded. Eli had grown too, stronger, taller, braver. He chased dragonflies near the creek and read stories aloud in the evenings, his voice growing steadier with each page. The days had found their rhythm, but one morning, Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the wash bucket. The scent of soap made her stomach turn, and a sudden wave of dizziness pulled her to the porch steps. She sat there in silence, the breeze pressing soft against her skin, and slowly the truth rose in her like a tide that could no longer be ignored. She was with child, not a suspicion, not a maybe, a knowing, ancient and rooted. She felt it deep in her belly, in her breath, in the stillness that had taken hold inside her. At first she wept, quietly with her hands over her face, not from fear, but from something larger, something that filled every part of her and spilled over. Joy wasn't the right word, nor relief. It was something sacred, something that felt like both. Later that afternoon, she walked down to the river where the water ran cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Tazhi was there, carving a flute from elderwood, his hands stained with sap, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she approached but said nothing, only watched her come closer, sensing something in her step, in her eyes. She knelt beside him and took his hand. "I'm carrying," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, the breeze stirring his hair. Then he set the carving aside and dropped to both knees, pressing his forehead gently to her belly, his hands resting on either side of her hips. She felt his breath warm against her skin. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his words were not for her, but for the sky, the trees, the earth beneath them. "Ah, hey," he whispered. "Thank you." He leaned back and looked up at her, and for the first time, his eyes held nothing but light, no shadows, no sorrow, just wonder. That night she polished the cradle in the corner until it gleamed in the firelight. It had waited so long, longer than her, longer than him. She sat at the table with paper and pencil and wrote a letter she would never send. Lottie, and she wrote, "He said 12 sons, but I think he meant 12 chances to begin again. This child is not a beginning of something new. It is the healing of everything old. I do not feel lost anymore. I feel found." She folded the letter and placed it with the others. Outside, the wind carried no warnings, only the scent of pine and warm earth, and the quiet promise that nothing would ever be the same again. The days unfolded like pages from a story no one remembered writing, but had always hoped to read. The sun rose earlier now, lingering longer in the sky before tucking behind the pines. The garden around the cabin had doubled in size, rows of beans and squash curving like the ribs of some great creature made of earth and promise. The world, once cold and cruel, had become gentle in its own way, not soft, but steady, and Clara had grown with it. Each morning after the fire was stoked and breakfast was finished, Clara sat Eli down at the small table near the window. He'd always squirm at first, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt or pretending not to see the letter she pointed to. But slowly he began to shape the sounds, to see the patterns, to stitch the stories together in his head. "This one's different," he said one day, squinting at the word hope. "It sounds softer," Clara smiled. "Because it is." She let him trace the letters with his finger, the way she once traced the scars that told her story. He didn't always get it right, but he always tried. And trying, she reminded him, was the strongest kind of courage. While they studied, Tazhi worked nearby beneath the porch roof, carving animals and shapes from cedar and pine. His hands moved with quiet purpose, knife gliding in smooth, practiced arcs. He made horses with flowing manes, wolves with fierce eyes, birds mid-flight. He gave the toys to Eli, and then to children in the village who began showing up with wide eyes and hesitant feet, drawn by stories that whispered through the hills. Maureen came often, sometimes bringing herbs, sometimes stories, and always a kind word. She taught Clara how to crush dried leaves into salves, how to find wild yarrow for fevers, how to use willow bark for aching joints. Clara soaked up the knowledge like dry ground drinks rain. There was power in knowing how to heal, she realized. Real power. Not control, not revenge, just restoration. As the weeks turned into months, word of the cabin traveled farther than the old trail. Women came first, some with children, some heavy with child, some simply seeking a place to breathe. Then came older men, worn from years of toil, who asked for salves and stayed for supper. They brought seeds, stories, hands willing to work. And soon the cabin was no longer just a home. It was a hearth for something larger. Clara and Maureen began a shared garden on the edge of the village. Rich soil turned by many hands. They taught others what they had learned: how to plant, how to heal, how to listen. Children helped carry water. Men built fences. A quiet movement took root, not with banners or speeches, but with bread shared between neighbors, laughter over soil-stained fingers, babies born into clean hands and open hearts. One night, Clara stood by the doorway, watching the fireflies gather like stars fallen too low. Inside, Eli slept with a carved fox tucked under his arm. Tazhi sat nearby, polishing another toy, his expression thoughtful. "We planted more than seeds," Clara said softly. Tazhi looked up and nodded. "And it's growing." The cabin, once a place of silence and sorrow, now pulsed with life. Not just theirs, but a whole circle of lives, stitched together by healing hands in the simple act of choosing hope. The morning her labor began, the air was thick with mist rising from the earth, the sun just a pale suggestion behind layers of cloud. Tazhi had already gathered water and stoked the fire. Maureen arrived before the second pain clenched Clara's belly, calm and sure as always, her shawl wrapped tightly, her satchel of herbs and linen slung over one shoulder. Inside the cabin, everything had been prepared. The cradle, freshly polished, sat by the hearth. The sheets had been washed and warmed. Clara moved between contractions like a woman walking through a dream, afraid and brave in the same breath. Tazhi never left her side, his hand steady in hers, his eyes locked onto hers whenever she faltered. He said little, but his presence spoke louder than any prayer. Eli hovered nearby, pacing with a nervous excitement, his carved fox tucked into the crook of his arm as if it could protect them all. When the child came, just after the noon sun finally broke through the clouds, his first cry filled the cabin like a bell tolling for the beginning of something sacred. Clara wept, not from pain, not from fear, but from a joy so deep it felt like the very ground beneath her had shifted. She held him to her chest, his skin slick and warm, his fingers curling instinctively around her thumb. Tazhi knelt beside her, his hands trembling for the first time she could remember. He touched the child's brow gently and whispered, "Ki Yaji," little boy. His voice cracked around the words. Then he placed both hands over his heart and closed his eyes, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear. A prayer, perhaps, or a thank you. Later that day, when Clara could walk again, they carried the child down to the river. Tazhi led them to a small clearing where the water ran slow and clear over smooth stones. There in the soft soil, they arranged a circle of White River rocks, 12 stones in all, one for each son in the promise Tazhi had once made aloud, long ago when the world had been colder and his heart heavier. The first stone bore the name of Ki-Yaji, etched carefully with a hot iron and cooled in the river's edge. Eli helped press the final stone into place, his hands surprisingly sure. He stood beside Clara, his face proud, older now, changed, not by years, but by purpose. He leaned down and whispered to the baby, who blinked up at him from Clara's arms. "I'll teach you everything I know," he said. In the days that followed, people came. They arrived on foot, by cart, some riding bareback down from the hills. They brought baskets of cornmeal, jars of honey, knitted booties, small bundles of herbs. Women Clara had never spoken to before kissed her cheek. Old men knelt beside the cradle, their hats pressed to their chests. Even those who had once looked at her with suspicion now bent low to meet the child's eyes, whispering blessings in trembling voices. The land felt different. It no longer held its breath, no longer whispered warnings through the trees. It pulsed now with something sacred, something sown not by conquest, but by healing. The earth that once watched in silence now watched in peace. Inside the cabin, the cradle was no longer empty. It rocked gently as the firelight danced across the walls. The silence, once a weight, was now a lullaby. And the promise Tazhi had once made, spoken in dust and disbelief, had begun its journey, not just in one child, but in the circle they'd built around him, stone by stone. The years moved the way seasons do in the high desert, quietly at first, then all at once. Snow melted into spring, spring warmed into summer, and the land yielded not just crops, but lives. The cabin, once a refuge for two broken souls, had become the heart of something larger, something sacred. Clara stood beneath the tall pines, her gray-streaked hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, her hands resting on her hips as she watched the children play. 12 of them now, some with Tazhi's quiet eyes, others with laughter too wild to have come from anyone but Eli. A few carried none of their blood, but all carried their love. Children left at doorsteps, children brought by grief, children born of safety instead of fear. They darted through the trees like wild deer, chasing each other between the trunks, barefoot and shouting, their voices ringing through the air like wind chimes on a storm's edge. Clara smiled as one of the youngest, a stubborn girl with braids and scraped knees, stopped to gather feathers and line them neatly on a stone. The cradle, once hers alone, had long since passed from home to home. It stood now in the schoolhouse Tazhi had built with his own hands, placed beneath the front window, where the light fell warmest in the afternoon. The school itself had taken 3 years to finish, built board by neighbors who were no longer strangers. It was one room, simple, with benches worn smooth by little hands, and walls decorated with drawings, maps, and stories painted in vibrant reds and browns. Tazhi taught the older ones numbers and maps, history from both books and memory. Clara taught letters, song, and the care of gardens and wounds. Eli, nearly a man now, taught the younger boys to carve, to fish, and, when no one was looking, to spit without getting caught. He was taller than Tazhi now, with arms lean from work and a laugh that could undo even the worst days. Sometimes at dusk, the three of them sat on the cabin porch and watched the sun fall behind the hills, saying little, sharing everything. Clara didn't count the years so much as she counted moments. First steps, first words, first tears wiped from cheeks that weren't hers but felt like they were. She remembered the first time she'd come to this place, frightened and unsure, and how the silence had seemed like a trap. But now silence was the music of peace, broken only by laughter, bird song, and the steady pulse of life lived fully. She knelt near the fire pit, smoothing the dirt around the stones of the old circle by the river. 12 stones now, 12 names, not all sons, not all from her womb, but every one a light, a beginning. And in that, the promise had been fulfilled. The cradle never stayed empty long. The land never fell silent, and the wind, when it passed through the trees, no longer mourned. It sang of renewal, of roots planted deep, of a love wide enough to hold the lost and strong enough to help them stay. In desert soil, hope had grown, and it would never stop growing.